Hello, lords and ladies of the realm. It is I, Emily Sophia, aka Mighty Sophia, here to break down for you guys the latest episode of Game of Thrones. We are on season 6, episode 7, I believe it is, The Broken Man. So, spoiler alert before we dive into the mad thick of things, as I shall be bearing all in this review. And for those of you guys who are curious, yes, in fact, I do intend on reviewing episode by episode the pilot season of Preacher, and my reviews will regularly be up on the Mondays preceding the Sunday night episodes. Okay, so a little bit later than you may be expecting, but that's what I'm gonna have to do to make it work with my schedule. So that's the thing. But you guys came here for Game of Thrones, so let's talk about that together. I shall be doing my best to pick up on all the juicy little details, but if there's anything that I happen to miss, please by all means lovingly correct or update me in the comments. Bring these things to our attention, because really this video is just the beginning of the conversation, and I might be looking a little more tired than usual. I just took a bath, so deal with it. Deal with it, I say. So, this episode, I expected to be a little bit bigger, but once again, the end game continues to be ever present. It is something that is knit in the fabric of every single episode going forward, pretty much since this season started. So another slower step in what is going to be an insane direction. And I think it's safe to say that we are gonna get ourselves a rather bombastic 9th episode. That tends to be the way of it with this show. And then the fallout shall ensue in the 10th episode, the season finale. So as far as this episode goes, there are some key themes that I think tie together the different stories that we got to look at this time around. And we also see more follow-up to some of the plot threads that we returned to last week as well. So this episode is kind of a nice companion piece to Blood of My Blood, which I believe is the name of its predecessor. So there's a lot that fits very well with that episode. And what do you freaking know? The man of the hour, Sandor Clegane, the freaking Hound, is back in the business and is in the land of the living, which cannot be said for quite a few of our fine feathered friends in the world of Westeros and beyond. So, congratulations, Sir Clegane, for returning to our midst. It may not be exactly what you wanted, but we're happy to have you. Okay, so let me start with some themes, and then we'll talk about some of the details and the nitty-gritties together. So if I had to break down this episode, I would say that there is a major theme of throwing off the old self and putting on the new self. There's a heavy emphasis on dealing with trauma and recovery and seeking retribution, and all of these gradual steps forward for a lot of very downtrodden individuals who are fighting to get back on top. We look at people who are forging new identities or reclaiming old ones. As far as those who are kind of forging new identities, or who are at least attempting to, we do of course have the Hound, as he has joined this country Septon and his little village, or whatever you would like to call his group, his posse, his people. It would seem that now that the gods have spurned him once again by giving him life, only for him to watch everyone around him die, he initially seems to be striking out in a new direction. He was found on the edge of death, and well, being one hard motherfucker to kill, he is back in the land of the living, chopping wood, doing manual labor, hanging out with the Septon, swapping stories. Not the first of which, I'm sure, is how he was almost completely obliterated by a woman and then left to die by another woman. So, you know, how do you like them apples? But yeah, so arguably the Hound is trying to kind of forge a new identity. I think that perhaps meanwhile we see those who are kind of reclaiming their identities. We have Arya Stark, of course, who is no longer simply a nameless girl, and for that has potentially paid the ultimate price. It's pretty scary business. And then there's Margaery Tyrell, who I do believe that I predicted in my previous review that she was totally playing the High Sparrow and trying to work the faith system to her favor. That definitely appears to be the case. And she is forging this new identity outwardly by pretending to be the mouthpiece for this new religion that she has joined. But ultimately what she is seeking to do is to reclaim an old identity, to reinvigorate House Tyrell, to put Highgarden back on the map, and to ultimately look out for her family and her house's interests. And I do need to make note of this before I completely overlook it, but the conversation that she had with the High Sparrow regarding her not fulfilling her womanly, wifely, queenly duties by visiting King Tommen's bed, the bed of consummation and baby making. Yeah, so that was not just a random little, oh, hey girl, I'm just making sure that everything's good in the bedroom, you know, little, the kind of chat that you might have with your pastor, I guess. But yeah, so that I think also plays into what I believe is her unfolding plan, to take back the power for House Tyrell, okay? Tell me if I'm crazy, but I think I'm on the right track with this one, and I'm sure that many of you are also in that same boat. And then, of course, we have Theon and Yara Greyjoy, and Theon especially is trying to forge a new identity in the midst of the serious trauma that he endured. It makes sense that he would be very uncomfortable in the pleasure house with his sister and crew, as they are eventually making their way to Meereen to try to strike a deal with the Queen of Dragons and take back the Iron Islands, all that good jazz. Yeah, he is coming fresh off of one of the most hellish experiences that one could possibly survive. Basically suffered every kind of torture at the hands of his captor, and now is in a position where he can give back to his family, his kin, his sister, who's gunning for the throne, for preeminence over the Iron Islands and all that good jazz. But yeah, he is working through quite a few issues and is really unable to, I mean, despite the really awesome speech that he delivered when everybody gathered together to try to decide on their new leader, it's clear that it is in his interest to support Yara and to stand beside her and to be a strong presence, but he's not quite at the point where he has come back into himself, and Yara is trying to push him to that point. It's like, you know what? You can kill yourself. You can straight up take yourself out of the picture if you are not in this with me. You know, you're not just floating through your life. You have to choose this. And I think it was really necessary to have that kind of bonding moment between their two characters. This moment where Theon is given the chance to truly redeem himself, to stop driving himself into the ground, to stop insisting that if they were truly to get justice, then he would have been hanged long ago. You know, he, like Mr. Clegane, is somehow still alive, and he has a choice, and it's pretty much time to rise up. Another big overarching theme in this episode is the idea that just the fight or flight concept, you know, those who are trying to flee the violence are caught in the undertow. And then there are those, you know, it's kind of that climbing the ladder of chaos kind of situation. You know, are you going to run away from the great war to come, or are you going to take your place in it? Are you going to raise up an army, or armies plural? Are you going to band men and women of all walks of life together to face what truly is threatening your existence? And it's very tragic, of course, to see that the Septon and his men and women and everybody who's bonded together with him in kind of this peaceful coexistence, they are all brutally destroyed, pretty much tossed under the bus for the sake of getting their resources or whatever, you know, that I'd assume that's what the Brotherhood was primarily after. But in the midst of people who are either forging new identities or reclaiming old identities, there is this idea of the war to come and taking your place, taking your stance, and kind of conceptualizing or contextualizing rather everything that you're doing in the face of the true war. And that's what we get to see in a really big way with Jon and Sansa and Davos as they go and pay a visit to all of these different houses who have pledged their loyalty to House Stark in the past. And they're not simply, it's not just about putting House Stark back on the map and solidifying their hold and their rule, but it's about bringing together all of these disparate houses, all of these disparate groups of people who have been completely fractured by the Boltons' violent rise to power. And it's about taking down a greater form of violence, the violence of the dead, with solidarity, with unity. And there is the idea that calling upon these old connections, these old house to house loyalties, they can bond together and face what's coming for every man, woman, and child. So there are big pieces of the puzzle that are moving, and it's so important to see that Jon and Sansa and Davos all very clearly understand this. And I definitely think that Sansa is kind of in a place of reclaiming her identity as a Stark. So is Arya. It's so cool to see how they're both doing that in their own ways, completely separate from one another, you know. When Lyanna Mormont challenges Sansa's loyalties and her identity. You know, are you a Lannister? Are you a Bolton? Who even are you, woman? To which Sansa says, you know, like, I am a Stark through and through, and I have done what I need to survive. That's the kind of stuff that makes me think back to shows like The Walking Dead. You know, this is kind of like, I mean, there are elements of The Walking Dead that I can kind of see are parallels to this show. This is all on a very grand and fantastical scale, of course, one that's quite different from The Walking Dead's post-apocalyptic universe. But nonetheless, interesting to kind of see how that stuff all connects, like the idea of being survivors, of coming together in the ultimate war between the living and the dead. And even though Lyanna is only able to pledge 62 of her men, we're making progress towards getting a conglomerate together, an army that's going to be able to take down the Boltons and take down the dead and get it all done in one fell swoop, hopefully. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, we see that House Glover is forging a new identity in light of what's transpired since the Red Wedding, since the former King Robb's failings as a leader. His essentially his failure to deliver House Glover from the assault that was waged on them by the Ironborn. And so it's really interesting to see how calling upon others in the name of House Stark works. But for House Glover, that's not going to work. And what the leader says, is that House Stark is dead. And they're not really given the opportunity to kind of to emphasize the war that's ultimately coming. The idea of them having to bond together with wildlings is to them totally reprehensible. But it's interesting to see how the wildlings do throw their hat in the ring with Jon, and how the giant among them, whose name I am embarrassingly forgetting, but I even saw it earlier tonight, so I apologize, but he stands for Snow. And then after Tormund Giantsbane talks some sense into the troops, they're like, hey, our causes are allied, and even though this wasn't what we bargained for initially, ultimately this is going to be the way that they are going to be able to march against the Night's King, against the White Walkers, and to be able to secure their longevity. So there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of pride, there's a lot of small-mindedness in the midst of some really huge things that are going to come to pass very soon. Now, I do have to ask you guys, to whom was Sansa addressing that little letter that she was writing back at camp? I don't know if we were supposed to judge that by certain context clues, and I know that there were conversations that were being had, but I didn't quite catch who that was to. So if you guys have any theories, I would love to hear those. Now, I do have to also touch upon things with Sandor Clegane as well. Now, I've been hearing hints and murmurings on the wind about something called the Clegane Bowl. I don't know. If you guys haven't heard of it, I'm not going to get into that business because it sounds like there's kind of some spoilery stuff going on. I don't know if this is just like a super strong fan theory or if there is stuff in the books that hasn't been quite tapped into. But yeah, there's much debate about where Sandor is going to be headed from here now that the people that he was with have been slaughtered, which I think is his punishment by the gods in a sense, punished by living and then by being surrounded by the dead. So he takes up his axe and arguably I think is going to be going up against the Brotherhood. Is that the Brotherhood without banners? See, there's all this stuff that we're getting back into that it's been seasons since we've even been in this territory, so I'm like, wait a freaking minute, who is where? And I feel like I need to draw like a crazy map and try to connect all the dots in my head. But where do you think our brother is going? Is his path ever going to collide or coincide with Arya's again? I have no idea at this point. I feel bad for the guy. He deserves a nap and some ale and a good soup and, the guy could really take a load off, but that it seems that is not to be. It's not in the cards for this fellow. So the gods are not done with him yet. Also excited to see how things progress with the Greyjoys. I don't know what all we're going to see this season, but there's quite a few people that are headed towards Meereen at this point. There's quite a few people who are headed towards River Run as well, of course. That's kind of the big thing I haven't talked about yet in this review. So we see Jaime and Bronn reunited, and it feels so good. And now Bronn is a little bit flustered because he's like, yo, I want my castle, I want my lady, I want all these things that have been promised to me. And Jaime's like, wait for it. We're gonna make this happen for you, buddy. I love their dynamic, which I think made everything that happened in Dorne slightly more tolerable, despite kind of the silliness in that department. It's good to see those two bros, going across the seas together. Very exciting stuff. Now, Brendan Tully, Mr. Blackfish, is on the scene, and this guy is hard as hell. It's very exciting to see him confront the Kingslayer face to face and totally rub everything in his face. So even though Jaime tries to take hold of the very pathetic and disjointed and disorganized siege that's being set up by House Frey, he takes things over. It's looking like he's going to be able to strike some fear into these guys, but the Blackfish is totally unfazed, and I'm digging that. So now bear in mind, of course, that Brienne is on her way out yonder to have her own meeting with the Blackfish, and perhaps even her own meeting with Jaime as well. So that's going to be fascinating to see. And as to when we're going to get more bloodshed at River Run, I couldn't tell you. But I'm very excited, very cool to get to learn more about the character of the Blackfish. And as for Arya, so she's got 2 giant bags of coins, and she's hoping it's gonna pay her way back to Westeros with a cabin the next morning. It seems like she has got things in the bag, and she feels pretty confident at her prospects. And as she's looking out at the Titan of Braavos and considering what the future holds for the one and only Arya Stark, that is, of course, when the waif catches up with her and stabs her a good time or 2 in the abdomen, at which point she proceeds to run bloodied through the streets. Everybody's just kind of like, oh, honey, you might want to get that looked at. The fact that the last scene that we get of her is her running through the streets bleeding out of her stomach suggests that the story isn't over. And again, I have a really hard time believing that we would be going through all of everything with her if this was not for some greater purpose. So I'm not throwing in the towel yet. I am frightened, as well I should be. This is Game of Thrones. But again, there's so much that is tying into the end game here. We are on the road to war, exploring what the cost of freedom truly is. Freedom for Margaery, for Theon, for Arya, for Sansa. There's so many characters that are in very similar boats. So many people who are grappling with their past traumas, who are trying to find their way again, trying to seek retribution for the ways in which they've been wronged, and people who, some of whom are teaming up simply to get back, or simply to achieve one smaller goal. And then there are those, of course, like Jon and Sansa and Davos, who are seeking to achieve a smaller goal and then ultimately translate that into achieving a much larger goal that has kind of all of mankind in perspective. So a quieter episode indeed, but big stuff, big introductions, big reunions. It continues to be really good, entertaining stuff for me. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Anything that I missed or failed to address in this review, bring it on up, y'all. I'd love to hear about it. So you guys take care of yourselves. I'll be back with my Preacher review next. And yeah, I will indeed be back before you know it.